Hello and welcome to the Indian Express. Today we have a very special guest, Dr. Raghuram Rajan. Thank you, sir, for joining us. And we'd be talking about some of the major issues that are sort of in the news on economy and policy. So let us start, sir, with the most important thing that is sort of occupying everybody's mind, which is about India's inflation problem. In the past 4 or 5 years, inflation has got the better of both the people and the central bank. And at one level, it is not odd because many central banks have sort of found themselves behind the curve. But how do you sort of see India's situation and who's to blame, as it were, for India's inflation? Is it that central bank, RBI, was behind the curve? Did it not do enough? Or how do you sort of see it?
So, I think without sort of pointing fingers, laying the blame, as you say, I think as you pointed out, across the world, we've had inflationary conditions, partly post-pandemic recovery, and partly, the wars and their effects. But I think if you look at India's inflation performance, to some extent, the biggest factor has been food, especially in recent times. And, that's something that obviously the central bank has to keep in mind, which is why we target headline consumer price inflation, but is less directly within its control. That doesn't mean it can ignore it, because if food inflation stays high for a long enough period, what will happen is it will get embedded in inflationary expectations and make it harder for the central bank to keep inflation under control. But I think if you look at the overall performance of the central bank over the last so many years since inflation targeting was brought in, it's been quite creditable relative to inflation in the past. We haven't had sustained episodes of double-digit inflation, for example. And, one reflection of that is the currency has remained relatively stable. So I think all in all, our new regime has performed reasonably creditably, and the central bank has performed reasonably in it. So the issue of levying blame, in a difficult situation, they have managed.
I ask you this question, persist on it, because there's increasingly, we saw in the US election, the difference between inflation coming down to an acceptable level, but affordability being an issue. So many people in India also might be feeling the same way. Inflation hits different people differently. That affordability over a sustained period of 5 years, if you have relatively high inflation above RBI's comfort zone, then affordability will take a hit. So, and a lot of people, academics, have argued that inflation targeting is not the right approach, that, some have even within the government have said that, food should be kept out, target something else. How do you sort of see that whole debate?
Well, I think the reason first that we brought headline inflation, CPI rather than core CPI, is because food is such a big part of the Indians' consumption basket that to ignore it is to ignore one of the biggest components of inflation. So you may, as RBI, say core inflation is coming down. Yeah. But if food inflation is high, people are hurting and they're saying, what world are you living in? You don't see the fact that we are hurting. True. That said, the other part of inflation is wage inflation. Wages haven't really been much stronger than consumer price inflation, which means that in real terms, in terms of things you can buy, wages, especially for the lower middle class, hasn't kept pace with inflation, or as much as it has in the past. So that is part of the reason people are hurting. At the lower end, their wages have not gone up. Now, in some sense, then the reality is we have to create more jobs, better jobs, higher quality jobs, more remunerative jobs. That, of course, is not the RBI's.
Exactly. So that is what brings me to the other question about, what can the government do while inflation control is typically the RBI's preserve and we tend to look at it. But as you said, food inflation is not something that sort of responds to repo rates. Yeah. What can the government do or could have done, in your view, which goes back to how a developing economy sort of responds to?
That is the real challenge that we have, right? We've been growing at about 6% last 30 years ever since we started reforms, which is hugely creditable for any country. The problem, however, is that the pandemic, we had some very low growth for a little while, strongly negative. A lot of the high growth we've had in the recent past has been rebound growth. If you look at our GDP level relative to what it would be if we had grown at 6% steadily through the pandemic, we are about 6% below, 1 year of growth below. That 1 year means a lot of jobs, okay? But also, what is important is our economy itself is not creating enough jobs. It is, if you look at manufacturing, for example, it's becoming much more capital intensive over time. For a labor intensive country, that is problematic because we're not creating enough jobs in manufacturing. In fact, if you look at the PLFS, where we are creating jobs is in construction and agriculture. Construction, of course, because of the boom in infrastructure spending, etc., is understandable. Agriculture is worrisome. Why are people going back to agriculture when, in fact, in every developing country, they should be coming out into the services and manufacturing? Now, services was creating jobs, but through the pandemic, it has not. We should see some revival in services. And we're not talking about IT services or consulting. We're talking about retail services. We're talking about transportation services. Those things will come back. They will produce more jobs. But I think the big question for the government has to be, how do we create more jobs and higher quality jobs?
Okay, I'll come back to both the growth and the unemployment question because we have massive news pegs on that. But I just want to round off the bits on RBI. One issue when you sort of took over was the issue of NPAs. How do you sort of see, now NPAs are much lower as against what it was at that time. It was just growing when you took over, and you actually were pushing for recognition. How do you sort of see that as a...
So NPAs are, like the part of the iceberg which is below the water. It's what you don't see often which is the problem, right? So what you have to do is constantly be alert for emerging NPAs. Now, what happened in my time was they had built up over time, and there was a lot of extend and pretend going on. Partly also the RBI had offered a moratorium in some sense on recognition. That moratorium ended, and we forced the banks to recognize more, which stopped the extend and pretend. And once the banks were cleaned up, they were in a position to actually make more loans. Their lending had slowed down, and that was the problem. That was what we were trying to solve. Of course, we have to constantly be on the alert because there may be new sources of NPAs. Recently, the RBI has been focused on unsecured retail loans. But this is something that you always have to be on the alert for. There's also the old iceberg which needs to be collected. We have written off those loans, but we need to recover some of the value of those loans.
On this question of loans being written off, a lot of lay readers and have a misconception perhaps, or a conception that all these writing off of loans is basically the rich getting away, and that narrative keeps going round and round. I just want to understand from you, how do you sort of see?
Think about it this way. When a loan is written off by the bank, it's the supervisors telling the bank, this hasn't paid for a long enough time. You must not carry it on your books at full value. In fact, in some cases, write it off completely. And that hits the bank's capital, which means the bank has to either raise more capital or put some more money of its profits into capital. The point of that is to ensure the bank is healthy. But when it writes it off on its books, doesn't mean that it has forgiven the borrower. It hasn't. Still, if it recovers money on those loans, they go to its bottom line. They show up as profits. So in a sense, this is a free way for bank management to make money because they're recovering on loans that were written off. They go directly to the bottom line. But the reality is that if it's out of sight, out of mind, once you've written it off, you don't bother collecting, then it's a problem. I don't think that's really a strong incentive because bank management, if they collect, they're going to show superior performance. So they should be incentivized to collect.
True. Now coming to the growth question, 2023 we saw a period where every quarter GDP data was surprising everybody. Street estimates were always behind, and there was it appeared as if India is sort of beating all street estimates and what is happening right through the year. And 2024 has been exactly the opposite. Every quarter the GDP growth rate has sort of faltered, and it has been, again surprised on the downside. So what exactly has happened here?
I think the reality is our underlying growth is about 6%. If we go much above that, it typically means something is a little off. Sometimes it's real. There's a lot of infrastructure spending before the election by the government. That helped add to growth. But there's also the matter of the GDP deflator, which tends to boost growth when it's really low and offsets that when it goes the other way. Then there were these taxes and subsidies, which again tend to affect GDP. All those things which worked in the same direction in boosting growth have gone the other way. For example, government infrastructure spending has been a little quiet for some time. It will come back, but it's been quiet. The bottom line is that we are going back to our normal rate of growth at this point, which is around 6%. Is that enough? No, because we clearly need many more jobs than we have right now. Whatever the unemployment numbers, everybody can quote whatever they want. The reality is there are far too many of our youth looking for better jobs. As you can see, for every government job, there are thousands of applicants. So we really need to boost the rate of job creation, and not just ordinary jobs, but good jobs.
On the question of growth sort of coming back to what it was, many of the viewers might recall that just before COVID hit, India's growth was less than 4%. So that was without, there was a secular deceleration that was happening over the last 3 years preceding COVID. And then COVID happened, there was a dip, and then there was a jump. And as you said, now maybe there's some kind of a coming back to the same level. So what exactly had happened at that time? Why did we have this massive jump beyond just the first year or second year? Because it's happened now for 3 years that we've had a lovely set of growth numbers. So.
Well, recoveries are not immediate, right? So remember, there were a few quarters of really negative growth, strongly negative growth during the pandemic. So the sort of spring back, the recovery has boosted growth over 2 or 3 years, right? Now, I thought where you were going is our real rate of growth the 2019 rate? Or is it the 20?
Because one thing is 6%, one thing is 4%, right? So where are we?
4% would be terrible if we go back to that. Now, we can never be sure what the true rate of growth is. I do think if you look at a 30-year expanse, our rate of growth is about 6%. And there's no reason why we should go significantly below that. So my hope is that with these, we may have another quarter of low growth, but we go back eventually to 6. But even with 6, it's not enough.
We have lost our potential growth rate from something around 7.5, maybe in 2007-8, to 6%. Just over the...
Well, the question you have to ask is, was 2007, 2008 sustainable?
Yeah.
I think it was genuine, but there's a lot of investment. Remember, investment numbers had skyrocketed. Last few years, we see corporate investment, really very tepid, given, even given the growth numbers in the last couple of years.
So for an economy like India, I was talking to an economist, he said that at 4%, India faces almost a stagnant kind of a scenario because of the number of people.
4% is deep recession from our perspective.
And a lot of people go by this textbook definition of what is stagflationary environment. But, India is not necessarily in the textbook sense facing a stagflation. But is this something similar to stagflationary kind of a scenario?
Yeah, I think if we go down to 4, we are in a terrible situation. Remember, we are in the sweet spot that every East Asian economy was when it gets a population dividend. A lot of young people coming into the labor force and reducing the dependency rate. That is, the old and the very young who cannot work. So our working population, working age population as a fraction of the population is growing. This is when our growth should, even relative to the recent past, go up by a percentage point or 2. if we create the jobs for the people coming into the workforce. The fact that we're not growing faster now is really worrisome, right? In other words, I keep saying 6% won't cut it, but it should be more than 6% just from the population dividend. It should be even more for us to become that goal of Viksit Desh by 2047. And if it's business as usual, it's not going to happen.
Right. So on the population question, I also want to come back because again, that's in news. But let me just ask you on the unemployment because you've talked about it. Increasingly, political parties of all different hues are promising government dole. And this has now sort of become an accepted norm. You can choose which section of the society you want to give that dole to and how much. And regardless of what you say your ideology is, everybody is giving the government dole. So on the one hand, you have unemployment, which is not getting solved at the rate at which should be. And other hand, you see this trend of government doles being given. Does that worry you that this trend is happening? And does that also mean that India or Indian politicians have sort of given up on solving for unemployment?
Well, I think there's a comparative political process to give out doles. Some transfers are not bad if they're targeted at the poor, because that gives them some ability. The poor mother has the ability to feed her children better, to invest in their schooling, etc. That's not terrible. But if you give out so much in dole that you cannot make infrastructure investments, that you cannot invest in public provision of services, better schools, better health care, for example, rural roads, those are things we need far more of if we are to grow. That's where the jobs are going to come from. Even in creating more schools, you create more teachers, etc. Those are good jobs. But you also create the skill base which employers can rely on. The problem right now is some of our state governments are spending so much on this. There's not enough to invest in really improving the capabilities of our population. And ultimately, we will live or die on the basis of how much we invest in our people.
Our productive capacity as
Our productive, and today, it's not as much your physical infrastructure, it's not as much all that other stuff, it's your human capital.
the point you made in your last book.
That's why we keep saying in our book, we don't care if it's manufacturing or it's services. Today, manufacturing cannot really, if it's globally competitive, employ unskilled workers. It uses machines. What it needs is workers who can take care of the machines. That requires a level of skills. Similarly, services. Yes, there's the high-skilled services, but even moderate services. Where does it pay? If you're a carpenter, if you're a plumber, those are the occupations which pay. If you're totally unskilled, there's not a lot of jobs available which pay you enough.
So this brings me back to the population question. We've heard some remarkable things being said. It almost appears as if 50 years of controlling population, all the lessons are forgotten. Now you can see a lot of people even arguing that we need more population to have economic growth. For a country that is already the most populous country on the planet, to say that we need to have more children to have economic growth seems bizarre at one level. The other problem is that many different states, some southern states have made this noise that, we must have more babies, for political reasons, maybe for,
Right.
How do you sort of see this?
The reality is in some states, right, the fertility rate has fallen below the replacement rate. And so, populations are sort of growing first relatively smaller and eventually will shrink in those states relative to the rest of the country. I mean, the reality is that, one, we are a country with very mixed sort of economic experience. The north, for example, Bihar, Uttar Pradesh, aren't doing as well as the west and the south in terms of per capita incomes. The south has already become rich enough, as the west has, for people to have smaller families, fewer kids, etc. Hasn't still hit some parts of the north as much. So, differential population growth. Of course, if you are worried about your state's position, you say I should focus on that. Now, What would be nice is if instead we encourage more immigration. Because truly, when do countries stay young even when they grow rich? A country like the United States, because a lot of immigration has taken place. In our country, we can have internal immigration, which takes care of the problem. And in fact, you see that. In Tamil Nadu, a lot of workers come from Bihar, come from Uttar Pradesh, and sometimes the word is they're the only guys who work, which I think is overstating I mean, I think there are lots of very good Tamil workers. In fact, we see a lot of firms coming from outside, looking for Tamil workers who are well educated, very, very capable. But the point is that we need to address this issue. And if the jobs are in the south and the west, allow for more immigration to happen. And recognize the fact that the immigrant is more a part of the south than a part of where they came from. Make it easier for them to bring their families also.
Maybe voting or, you know.
Yeah, I mean, look, in Europe, they're confronting this issue. Then there's the issue of our culture being affected. We'll have to manage that internally. But at least we're one country. And we'll have to find ways of doing it.
Okay. One question I wanted to ask you was about GST. You know, a lot of people say, you know, again, links back to what government could have done on say, inflation control, is that, you know, GST, nobody denies that for a long time India wanted to have a GST, and, you know, it was a great success to have that legislation and shore up that. But has India's GST really worked out the way you would have hoped for, in terms of both the way it is in the intricacies and also the levels of the rates? You know, some people say that the rates are so high, you know, so onerous that it has made it difficult, and inflation is high because of that also.
I don't think inflation is ever affected in a sustained way by tax rates being higher, or, I mean, growth could be affected, one can discuss that. You know, I mean, yes, there is an ideal GST. It would have been nice to go to fewer slabs and so on. But we are where we are.
No, why can't the government, I mean, one counter argument is that why can't the government sort of cut it substantially and give a demand boost if demand is struggling?
Yeah, I mean, what you don't want to do is bring in new instruments which create more uncertainty. If you constantly cut and raise GST rates, then people don't have an ability to plan, and then you have the whole lot of lobbying, cut my rate, keep his rate high, etc. I would say keep, you know, work
stable
on normalizing the GST rates over time, but offer some predictability. Use the instrument that you have to boost demand, which is on the monetary side. As you see inflation come down, you can cut rates. And on the fiscal side, if you see a need, you know, targeted demand expansion can happen. I think the reality, however, is that where there is demand, it's typically the lower middle class and the middle class. That has been hurting more in this expansion. The upper middle class